Hi there, ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls. We have a tremendous wrestling card for you today here on All-Star Championship Wrestling, which, of course, features the world's greatest wrestlers.
My little itty-bitty bruiser buddies.
United States heavyweight champion from Brazil. The world's heavyweight champion from the AWA, Nick Bockwinkel.
The Midwest supporting, bruiser loving, positivity spreading, world's most dangerous podcast. Join former pro wrestler and promoter Dave Dynasty as he supports and promotes Midwest pro wrestling. Keep on growing with the Midwest Express. This is the Dave Dynasty Show.
Greetings and welcome to the Dave Dynasty Show. I am your host, Dave Dynasty. Thank you for joining us for another episode. We have a great episode today for you. We have an interview with the one and only Supermouth, Dave Drazen, former Detroit photographer and manager. He has a ton of stories to tell. Very, very interesting, entertaining, very knowledgeable. Lots of history that he experienced firsthand. Dave will no doubt be a returning guest on the show. There's so much more that I want to talk to him about and more stories I want to hear. But we have a great interview with him today. We also have some audio sent in to us by our bizarro roving correspondent, Prof Ouch, with Abdullah the Butcher. Talk a little bit about his time in Detroit. More on that in a minute. Let's take care of some of our housekeeping dates and so forth here. Let's get this by. Remember, you can go to powerslam.tv and check out the best in independent wrestling streaming. They have over 100 promotions, over 4,000 hours of streaming content. Great stuff. And if you go and sign up, use the promo code Dynasty, you get 1 month free. So go check them out. I have been watching the heck out of them, and I'm loving it. Cannot recommend it enough. So go sign up, use the promo code Dynasty, get 1 month free. Some dates coming up that you might want to keep in mind. We will be, meaning the Dave Dynasty Show, will be in Chicago for C2E2. Not as guests at the convention, but attending C2E2 the weekend of March 22nd through 24th. It's going to be a very cool event if you're a wrestling fan. Jim Cornette will be there running his booth and doing an After Dark special of his. And plus, if you're into it, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega will be there. And they just announced CM Punk and Marty Scurll will be there. So at the Pro Wrestling Tees booth. So if you're into that, those guys will be there too. So check it out. If you're going to be there, let us know. Maybe we can say hi to each other. Another show you'd like to check out on March 31st, Asylum Wrestling Revolution in Indianapolis. Have a great show coming up featuring Drew Skills, Calvin Tankman, Apollo Star, Dale Patricks, much more. That's the show that I'm going to try to go to and attend. Very excited about that. It's going to be a great event on Saturday, May 11th. There are two great shows you can check out here in the area. Evolve Wrestling will be in Indianapolis, Indiana. That's a rare chance to check out Evolve in Indy. And if you're not going to make it to that, go to Hanover, Indiana, and check out Supreme Wrestling. A great show there on May 11th featuring Jerry the King Lawler, Doug Gilbert, Jason Kincaid, and much more. And in a future event, we're talking a couple years down the road here. A year down the road. Next year, the Squared Circle Expo will be kicking off their things, and they have announced that their convention in May of 2020 will be held in Indianapolis. So mark that on your calendars. Be prepared for that event coming up. So we had a fun week here on the Dave Dynasty Show. We released the first of the month, our first Midwest ratings, kind of our nod or tip of the hat, so to speak, of nostalgia to Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the rankings. They used to have the magazines. I was always a fan of the rankings, love the rankings. I'm a numbers kind of guy, and I like that in the organization. So I kind of put something together, got with some of the promoters and stuff, and did those, and it was fun. I think it was cool. It was very well received. Of course, there's always negativity and feedback, and guys say, well, why wasn't I listening? Why was this wrong? Guys, I have to tell you, most of these rankings were provided to me by the promotions themselves. I didn't necessarily do it. A couple of them I did. But, man, why do people get hung up on this? It's just fun, right? There's nothing writing on this. No one's getting paid more or whatever else. And it's just something to have fun, try to get a little eyes on the Midwest and these wrestlers, and start some conversations. And why people can't have respectful conversations is beyond me. But anyway, for the guys that were on there that thought it was kind of cool, congratulations. It is neat. Everybody on there deserved it. Again, everybody always asks, what's this promotion list? Well, I can't rank and include every promotion in the Midwest. It'd be impossible. So the plan is we're going to put these out at the beginning of every month, and there'll be a rotating cast of promotions on there. We'll get different promotions on different months, so that way everybody gets a chance. It's just not possible to list them all. So everybody take a deep breath, just relax and enjoy. And remember, wrestling's supposed to be fun, guys. Let's keep it fun. So anyway, we're going to go now. We're going to talk, go to this audio sent in by our bizarre roving correspondent, Professor Ouch. Check him out on Facebook. You can look him up at Professor Ouch, or you can look up Bizarre in Philly. He's also on Twitter. I believe he's on Instagram, but check him out. He's got a lot of cool things for sale if you're into the bizarre, essentially. But he's a great wrestling fan, and he's a huge fan of Abdullah the Butcher. And he went to a recent event on the out the East Coast, and got to talk to Abdullah. And he talked to him a little about his days in Detroit. Now, this audio is not perfect. It's not great. I have cleaned it up as much as I can, but do keep in mind it is at an event. There is background noise. I tried to eliminate some of it, but there is some background noise there that kind of interferes. And contrary to what you might think, Abby's actually kind of a soft-spoken kind of guy when he talks. So there are parts where it's maybe a little hard to hear, but I think it's still cool. Thank you very much, Professor Ouch, for sending this in. He's going to do some more of these things for us in the future because he gets out there to a lot of events, meets a lot of people, and talks to them. So he'll be sending some cool stuff in. So here we go. Let's check out that audio sent in by Professor Ouch with Abdullah the Butcher.
All right. I'm here. It's a professor for Dave Dynasty Radio, and I'm with a living legend, one of the greatest living legends of wrestling. We're going to talk a little bit about his times and beginnings in Midwest and Detroit wrestling. I'm here with Mr. Abdullah the Butcher. How are you, sir?
Very good, sir. Yourself.
You've been all over the world. You've done everything you could possibly almost do in the business, and have made such a part. But you started out. You originally got your start in Midwest and Detroit area, didn't you?
Detroit area. I was teaching some of the police, and I was at the Winter Arena. There was a guy by the name, the manager was Penasino. He was an Italian boy. He was the manager of the place. And he said, Abdullah, you should get into the wrestling business. And I said, crap. And he said, I'm going to introduce you to Jack Britton. Jack Britton came down, seen me working out. He said, I like you. He took me over. He said, I'll pick you up tomorrow. Took me over to the gym in Detroit, Michigan. He brought his son with him, his name was Gino Brito. And I think I'm a couple of months or a month older than him. And he brought me into the business. And then there was...
What year was that? Do you remember?
Oh, I've been in the business 57 years.
That's as many years as I'm alive, my friend.
That's right. Then there was another guy by the name Chris Tolis. You remember the Tolis brothers?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Then I wrestled them. I wrestled everybody from Luthez, the Sheik. I wrestled everybody.
You were telling me that when you first got in, pay wasn't that great. You went back to work at a regular job, and then they asked you to get back in again.
I had a janitorial service, huge clothing store, and that's what happened. I started the wrestling business at that time. Wasn't paying me that kind of money, so I went back to Ford Motor Company. That was it.
And then you were telling me they came in. It was an interesting story how they got you back to work.
They got me back. The guy said that Crybaby Ken says they need somebody in Vancouver. They're going to give you a big push. But at that time, I didn't think that he had what do they call it? His car was broke down, and he wanted to use my car. Then he got me up there. And when he got me up there, they asked me to do the honor, right? And I started saying, damn, if they want to do something for me, why do they want me to do the honor for somebody else? So anyways, I got up there and, okay. I was in Seattle, Washington. The guy's name was Harry Elliott. And I pretty near started a riot. And the promoter ran down there and said, change the finish. That's what happened. Then I went to Vancouver, Rod Finn said, hey, he caused a riot in Seattle, Washington. He said, I hear you're good. Then I said, he said, we're going to get you a manager. I said, no, the only manager I want is Crybaby Cannon. He said, well, Crybaby Cannon, we didn't even know you were coming up here. So I said, sir, I don't believe that. He said, you calling me a liar? I said, no, sir. He said, go there and get that big fat son of a big fat player. And when he came in there, he started talking other shit. And that was it. So that's all I'm going to tell you.
Wait, what did you tell the promoter? You set him up with?
Huh?
What did you tell the promoter when he brought Cannon in?
So Cannon came in and he said, Cannon, we didn't know that this guy was coming up here. He said, yeah. He said, no, we did not know nothing. And so I said, well, since that he didn't know nothing, then I don't need you for a manager. And that was it.
There you go. You got another funny Crybaby Cannon story. You want to share that where you're going through a tunnel?
Yeah, we're going to the tunnel, and the son of a bitch said, Abdullah, I got a flat tire. Do me a favor. Check the tire for me. I checked the tire, and he took off. And left me in the tunnel. He went up there and told the customs people there's a crazy black guy in there screaming and hollering. And then they came down there, and they said, take it easy, take it easy. Then they said, I said, some white son of a bitch, dropped me off and told me they had a flat tire, whatever, blah, 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 blah. So anyways, what I done, as soon as I got home, I called the fire department. And the fire department sent the fire department to his house and the house burned. And that was it.
That's crazy. So you worked in Detroit from, how long were you in that area before you went elsewhere?
Oh, a long time.
Yeah.
I was in Detroit. I worked all through Detroit. I was on Channel 7. And the Sheik was on Channel 19. Channel 9. That was it.
And you worked on your original name, your first name?
No, Jack didn't give me the name, the Great Zealous Amaro.
Zealous Amaro.
Yeah.
And how long did you work before you became Abdullah?
When I went to Vancouver. That was it.
So it was a short time as Zealous?
Yeah. Then the guy said there was a lot of Indians up here. So we're going to call you Abdullah the Butcher. Abdullah the Butcher. Because the way you caused riots and that was it. I'm very sorry, sir, but I cannot talk anymore, and I appreciate it if you would leave me alone. What did you say your name was again?
My name is the
what?
Noble Iron Sheik. I'm a Professor Ouch. Well, can you share? I know you don't want to talk about because you're working on a book and you're coming over to Japan for your official retirement.
Yeah.
What do you want to tell the fans anything about that?
Well, I'm getting ready to retire in Japan. Been going there for 48 years. And it's going to be an honor and a pleasure to go back to Tokyo and retire there. I mean, and in May I'm going to Texas for my anniversary, for my Hall of Fame ring.
Oh, really?
Texas, something like that.
So then in August you'll be going to the Charlotte Convention? And, well, would you share any remembrances of the Sheik with us?
What Sheik?
The original Sheik, Mr. Farhat.
Well, the original Sheik was okay, but he was a jealous man because I was doing more than him. Mm-hmm. See? And that was it. I'm sorry, sir. I'm finished.
Oh, you were so tough. All right, well, thanks, Mr.
All right, sir. I'm finished. Please, now get away from me. Don't leave me alone.
Well, that's it. I got chased out of the hotel by Abdullah, and luckily I was faster than him for once. Well, thanks again, Mr. Abdullah.
If you are looking for the best books, DVDs, and posters on classic wrestling nostalgia, then you want to visit crowbarpress.com. There are literally dozens of titles there, including biographies of the likes of Bruiser Brody, Ole Anderson, Ivan Koloff, and of course, Dick the Bruiser, as we've spoke about here on the Dave Dynasty Show. You want to visit crowbarpress.com for all of your classic wrestling nostalgia needs. Again, that is crowbarpress.com. All right, and we're back on the Dave Dynasty Show. I am Dave Dynasty, and I am joined today by longtime Detroit manager and photographer, Supermouth, Dave Drazen. Dave, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, fantastic. Thanks for having me on, Dave. Much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start right from the beginning, Dave. Tell us your first memories of professional wrestling, whether it be attending a show or watching on TV or whatever it might be.
Oh, would have been watching on TV. I'd say my first ones would have been in the late 50s. Bert Ruby, his promotion here, Motor City Wrestling, and watching, the guys of that day. But it really came all in one for me when my parents, who owned a 2-story home in east side of Detroit, our upper flat was for rent, and Leaping Larry Shane and his wife moved in. Oh. And it's like, seeing him on TV as a kid, I'm like a 5-6-year-old, and then, seeing him, it's like, oh my God, it's Leaping Larry Shane, the most famous wrestler in Detroit. He's living upstairs from me. How can this be happening? And it was a dream come true. From then on, that's really the start of my wrestling life.
Did when Larry was around you, did he keep up kayfabe? Did he keep up, with you, or did he let his guard down any with you as a kid?
I didn't, when you're that young, you were still a believer.
Sure, yeah.
You believed what happened, and, so you didn't know what kayfabe was, but he was just a nice guy.
Yeah.
We really didn't discuss wrestling and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there was times, he'd be home, and we'd be playing catch with a baseball out in, the front of our house, and, just the nicest guy.
Yeah. So when did you start going to shows? I'm assuming they're at the Cobo.
Well, the very first one I went to, Larry Shane took me to, and that was 1961 at WXYZ Channel 7 Studios here in Detroit.
Yeah.
What they used to do is do the afternoon TV show to promote the show at night to get the fans, to get the butts in the seats. Well, he asked my mom if he could take me along, and it's like I was a 6-year-old kid, and it's like, I went with him. I was just happy, So anyway, we get to the TV studio, and there's a big long hallway, and we're walking, and he's got his briefcase and stuff, and out, or suitcase, and out of one of the side rooms comes Ricky the Crusher Cortez, and that was his biggest nemesis back in the day. And I'm like a 3.5-foot kid, and it's like these two behemoths, they're going to start brawling right here in the hallway.
Yeah.
And it's like I was scared to death. And it's like, Ricky saw, but, I know now what happened. He, backed off, went away. And, that was my very first show that I went, so I saw the TV taping. But the most ironic thing was maybe 15 years later, I ended up managing Ricky the Crusher Cortez.
That's funny. Did you, when you did you tell him that story when you were a kid? What did he have to say?
Oh, yeah. Well, at that time, when I first started managing Ricky, he, was, up in age.
Yeah.
But he lived in the past, in his glory days.
Yeah.
I mean, he was doing, at the time I was managing, we were doing spot shows and, doing shows for George Cannon up in Superstars of Wrestling up in Toronto and Montreal.
Sure.
So, trying to revive his career. He's still a good worker and stuff, looked good, but, he was on in years. But, whenever we talked, he talked about, Larry Shane and Bert Ruby and Brute Bernard and all the guys from back in those old glory days.
Yeah. Well, and later you started attending regularly, and not only attending, but you were taking some pictures from your seat, right? I mean, were you already kind of into photography and taking pictures, or did that kind of develop when you started going to the shows?
My very first show I went to, a little background on it. It's like it was in the summer of 1965. Us kids, summertime, you're playing baseball all day long. We're playing baseball, and one mother yells down the street to the next to the ballpark, "Hey, come on home!" Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, this one day we're playing baseball, and a bunch of the kids, at like 5 o'clock say, "Hey, we got to go." And it's like, "Hey, there's like 4 more hours of sunshine left. what do you mean you're going? Oh, no, we're going down to Cobo Hall for the wrestling. It's like, what? You're kidding. Oh, you want to go? I ran home, asked my mom. She gave me some money, says, go, get out of here, go enjoy it. And I went with these guys, and it's like one of the greatest thrills of my life. Yeah. You know, we sat in the middle of what was called the red seats at Cobo Arena back then. Uh-huh. You know, $2 for the seat. I took my Brownie camera, you know, that my mother let me use, and I had the camera and a roll of film, 12 pictures, so I had to, use them discretionally. And then, I was done. The matches were over. You know, the Sheik was there, Bull Curry, Killer Carl Cox, Bobo Brazil, Johnny Powers. It's like, I couldn't wait to see the photographs. So at the end of the show, I opened up the camera to see what the photographs were.
Oh, no.
I had no idea that you had to develop the film.
Right.
So I learned from there. And then it's like I've never missed a show since that very, 1965 date until I started, working for the Sheik as his photographer. Mm-hmm. And it's like, from 65 to, as it went down, and then I got a, second row, seat, ringside, and then one gal, she would come to shows infrequently. She'd let me use her front row seats. So I started taking my camera, getting great pictures. I started sending them to magazines and writing stories, Wrestling Review, mm-hmm. Wrestling World, Wrestling Monthly, Ring Wrestling, everything. So, as time developed, I got better in my photography and stuff. And then, luckily in 1971, I had been taking photographs up at the ring. Well, first of all, in St. Louis for Sam Muchnick. Uh-huh. I used to go down to St. Louis a lot with Don Wilson and, the WFIA and that whole group there. Yeah. And he, introduced me to Sam Muchnick, who, he liked my enthusiasm and stuff, and he took a liking to me, and I was the only photographer that was allowed up at the ring at the Kiel Auditorium.
Wow.
And, I got to, meet a lot of the guys, Bobby Heenan and so many others, over time, and, those great shots. And then it's like I came home and I couldn't break, being the photographer at Cobo, which would have been a dream job. But a promoter in Cincinnati, Les Ruffin, let me take shots up at the ring in Cincinnati and then Dayton. And then it's like, God, I'm taking shots, great shots at, some of these big-time wrestling venues. Mm-hmm. How come I can't do it in Detroit? And then they had a big show right at the time when the Bruiser was coming in as a rival promotion.
Sure.
And the Sheik, oh, God, he brought in talent, NWA talent from all over the country. And it's like, oh, God, I got to be at this show. I got to photograph this. So I dug out my Wrestling Review press card, showed it to a guard who, showed it to Joyce Farhat, of all people, took me into her office. I asked if I could take photographs. Boom. Up at the ring, to let all the guards and security know I'm okay. And then from that day on, I started selling my photographs to them and started working basically for, big-time wrestling. And then I found out I'm working for the Sheik now, and it just, went from there.
Yeah. You mentioned the WFIA. You were very, very involved with that. How did you kind of become, were you like a member? How did you become kind of a key person in the WFIA in those years? And what years was that?
Well, it would have started in 1967 because there was a few fan conventions here in Detroit. Mm-hmm. There was also one in 1966 in Cincinnati, which was the very first place I met a guy, wasn't a wrestler yet, but his name was Jim Fanning.
Sure.
Who turned out to be Handsome Jimmy Valiant.
Yeah, right.
And in 1967, we had the riots in Detroit. In that summer, we still had this wrestling fan convention going on, and it was, more of a fan. It was an inside kind of job, kind of thing. It's Dawn Porter and a couple other of her cronies. They put this thing together, and it really had nothing to do with the fans and the awards for the wrestlers. And then Don Wilson and his wife decided, this isn't right. And they wanted to start this organization and start doing fan conventions where the fans got involved and stuff. And I was right on the ground floor with them and, was on their board of directors, from day one. in 1968 when it was formed, and their first fan convention in Mankato, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like I attended and was a host and the MC at many of them over time.
Yeah, there was WFI was a very big deal, and over those years, I remember. I mean, I was a member, but it was very late in the end of it, towards the end of it, when it really wasn't as as prominent as it once was. But we had on Norm Keatzer a couple weeks ago, and you mentioned some of his magazines that you were contributing to. Did you cross paths with some of the other guys in kind of the Midwest that was contributing, the Jim Cornettes and the John Lawsons and those kind of guys? How often did you cross paths with those guys?
Oh, a lot of times. When I was still a kid in high school, I would be traveling the country, on the weekends, going to wrestling shows.
Mm-hmm.
I'd, get a standby flight. I'd be flying to Georgia, St. Louis, L.A. without my parents even knowing. So I'd be down in like Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'd, meet up with Gene Gordon, one of the greatest photographers of all time.
Right.
In L.A., Theo Ehret. So a lot of these times I'd meet a lot of these photographers, around the country, and they, allow me to, shoot right alongside of them up at the ringside,
right.
And I'd get tips from them and stuff, and, they were a lot of great people.
Yeah. And you mentioned, obviously now you're working as the official photographer for Big Time Wrestling and the Sheik. When did you start doing the body press program? Because you were very key in that at some point, right?
Yeah, not long after I started being the photographer and, letting them use my photographs and stuff like that, there was a guy, Frankie Diamond, who was wrestling, but he worked in the office as a muscle and a runner and stuff like that. He came up to me one day, we became friends, and he says, "Hey, I'm getting ready to leave the territory here." He's going to work in the Kansas City territory for Bob Geigel.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I do some stories for the body press here and stuff, and I know you're a good writer. Hey, I can put a word in for you if you want to start writing, stories for the body press. And it's like, sure. So, we went in, talked to Joyce Farhat, and he says, hey, this kid, has stories in all the national magazines. He would be great, for doing stories for the body press.
Sure.
And she says, sure. So I started, just sitting at my typewriter, during the day, typing these, imaginary stories out, just thinking the most bizarre things I could, because you can't interview all these guys and use that kind of stuff, So I just make up these bizarre stories and, give them to them, and they would pay me $5 a story.
Yeah, it is so remarkable to me how many guys got their start with this kind of stuff. I mean, the photography and the programs. I mean, I know here in the Midwest we had Scott Romer and Dave McLean and all that. These guys started as young photographers and ended up being on-air talents. And of course there's a Cornette and like we said, I mean, Eddie Gilbert was writing for Norm Keatzer and Paulie Dangerously, Paul Heyman. And it's remarkable to me all the talent that started in this kind of the same vein of taking pictures and writing stories and things like that. It's pretty incredible. These guys that started with their fandom and this is how they got their foot in the door.
Well, it's funny sometimes when I'm doing a lot of my tribute videos, which are on YouTube,
sure, yeah.
And I come across photographs that I've collected and, traded, for way back in the 60s and 70s. I look at some of these photographs and it's like, it's a Jim Cornette photograph. It's a Paul Heyman photograph. It's, a Danny Goddard photograph. All these guys who were great photographers who, eventually, got into the business.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and at what point did you meet Brian Bucantis? Because he's another big photographer in Detroit. So, when did you guys meet and cross paths and start getting to know each other?
God, we knew each other, before any of us really were, we were just fans.
Yeah.
There was myself and Brad McFarlane and Gary Warrencheck and Gary Mancuso, Gary Kamenczak, Brian Buchanan, we were just all fans, and we'd, meet up at Cobo and we'd, trade photographs and talk and stuff. And, at the time I was the first one to get lucky and, and I got the job as, photographer at Cobo Arena, and for the Sheik there. And it's like, and that at the time, Brian, he was ahead of his time too. He was the first one to put out a program against the body press that he was selling outside of Cobo Arena.
Right.
And, oh boy, I'm trying to think of what it was called right now. But, at first, the insiders, Sheik and everybody, heard that somebody was selling a program outside, It's like they stopped them. And then Brian wrote a letter to the Detroit News or Detroit Free Press, one of the big newspapers here, and said, well, as long as you're on the street and selling it, they can't do anything against you, So, he kept on selling it, and, I think he was selling it for 25 cents originally, and people were buying that and, the body press program. So, they were getting truth in one, not truth in the other.
Yeah. And you mentioned, you mentioned Gary Warrencheck. Yeah, we had him on the show as well, and he ended up, again, becoming an on-air talent in the late years for Bruiser in the Bruiser Bedlam. And then obviously went on to public service and then running his own shows there in the Michigan area that were really big and really successful. And so it's kind of remarkable how many guys in your circle there and with your group of fans that really went on to be kind of key players here in the area, in the territory. And like you said, big time wrestling in the 70s was just huge. And I mean, the draws were great. The shows were remarkable. And Cobo kind of became the Mecca of the Midwest. You hear about the Cow Palace and Madison Square Garden and all these other things. And the Cobo was right there mentioned in the same breath. What was it like attending those shows through those years and seeing these shows live and in person? As you said, sometimes in the first row, second row, so up close and personal.
Well, it was fantastic. At the time, when they really hit it big, I was working for them. So it was like, I was I was doing the photography stuff. I'd be in the dressing room, and all these great guys who, some of them, would be coming from all over the country. Who, like a few of them that would come in from St. Louis or something. It's like, basically they're looking at me like, "What are you doing here? Don't you live in St. Louis?" And I was, "No, I'm from here." And then, like Dick Murdoch of all people, and Dusty Rhodes.
Right.
Meeting up with these guys and seeing them and talking to them, and then going out there and shooting photographs and at the time the Sheik had his mobile TV unit, which he stopped doing studio wrestling shows, and he was filming them live, and he was way ahead of his time. He was the first promoter to even do that. Way before WWF was doing it.
Right.
It was a magical time, seeing sellouts and, a lot of the great talents. And, the bouts, some of the bouts are just so magical that, it's hard for me to forget. Even though you got, always the Sheik bout, was, the highlight of the evening.
Sure.
But for me, sometimes people ask me, what was the best wrestling bout I ever saw? And I would have to say it would have been Frankie Lane versus Chris Colt.
Oh,
that match was just unbelievable. The moves that these guys did, pure wrestling.
Sure.
There was, some, gouging and, all that kind of stuff too. But the moves that these guys did, it was just a magical wrestling match that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I've seen, stuff where, Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk going at it in St. Louis in an hour Broadway. I've seen Harley Race go against, numerous people hour Broadways, just unbelievable matches. But that would have been my top match, Chris Colt and Frankie Lane.
Yeah. Chris Colt's another guy that was very ahead of his time. Was as far as, especially obviously in ring, his ring work, gets heralded, but even his character development and things he was doing were very, he was painting his face to a degree years before anybody else was and doing different things like that.
We were friends. I met him when he was first one of the Hell's Angels.
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
And he was very nice to me.
Yeah.
And we had a mutual friend, Tom Burke,
right.
So we would, always have that thing, and we would always talk. And then over the years, when I was working for George Cannon up in Montreal, he brought Chris Colt in, and he goes, "Well, this is perfect. Chris Colt with his, thing and my rock and roll kind of, shtick thing, managing, he was going to put us two together. And it was like, oh, man, this is like a dream come true almost, for me, working with Chris Colt.
Right.
But it didn't work out because Chris, at that time, the demons were with him, and, he didn't want a manager. He wanted to do his own thing.
Sure.
But, he talked to me about it. He says, nothing against you. It'd be great. But he also, this is one thing that Chris always said about me, too, on my managing thing. It's like, who takes credit for bringing entrance music into professional wrestling?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's happened here and there, but not on a big basis. But, a lot of times people say I'm the one credited because when I first started managing, that's what I wanted to do.
Sure.
Bring my guys out to rock and roll music.
Yeah.
I'm not ever going to get the credit for it, but, I was one of the first ones, I think, who ever did it.
Yeah. And we've mentioned some names here and some underappreciated, unheralded type talents. And two guys that always jump out to me when I have this conversation with people and who are big key players in the Detroit area is Fred Curry and Don Kent. And I always tell people all the time, these two guys do not get the recognition they deserve. Tell us, you saw them firsthand in their prime there in Detroit. Tell us about these two guys. Start with Fred Curry and what he was as a talent.
Oh, God, he was unbelievable. He was like one of the very first high flyers that came into big-time wrestling. I mean, even though they had Edouard Carpentier, who did, a lot of acrobatics and did the flip off the top rope and stuff, but Fred Curry with his drop kicks, I mean, that was unbelievable at the time. He was a really great young worker, got over big time with the fans. He was just an instant hit with everybody here in big-time wrestling, even though his father, Bull Curry,
Sure.
Was just the opposite. He was the, incredibly bad heel. And it's like, fans couldn't, sort of differentiate between the two. How come the good and how come the bad,
Yeah.
And then, at one point, they started tag teaming against, the Kangaroos and other, talents like that.
Sure.
Freddie, he was great.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Kangaroos, and that leads us right into like the other name that always comes to mind for me is Don Kent. I'm such a huge Bulldog Don Kent fan, and a lot of people are not even aware of exactly who he is. What was Don Kent like there in Detroit?
Well, I first saw Don Kent when he was Joe Smith.
Sure.
In the very early '60s.
Yep.
Good, solid guy, hard worker, great in-ring talent, could do everything. He could take bumps, he could sell, he can, create heat, and that's what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he, joined up with Al Costello, I mean, he basically was the workhorse of the Fabulous Kangaroos.
Sure.
Al was getting up in age, even though he could still work, but Don Kent was the workhorse. And I'll leave it at that. After, he split with the Kangaroos, he became the Bulldog Don Kent and stuff like that. And it's like, that's, when I first became a manager, we crossed paths and it wasn't good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that though. Let's talk. You transition to a manager. You're taking the photographs. You're doing the programs. So how did that transition happen? Where you started managing and working ringside and being an on-air talent?
Well, Sheik knew I wanted to do this for a long time. I've been friends with like Bobby Heenan and Abdullah Farouk and so many other of these managers, and I was only a 140-pound young teenage kid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I could never profess to be a professional wrestler.
Sure.
But I always liked the managing side of things. I liked the way these guys went on TV and put these guys over and said the things that they did. Just these outrageous things. But that's what it took to get people to either hate you or to come see you get your ass beat.
Right.
And that's the thing of a manager. That's I learned over time. And then what happened? Sheik knew I wanted to do this, and he helped me out. We would always be cutting promos either in the studio up in Williamston or at Cobo. And at the very end, he would have me go up with one of the guys and say, okay, 2 minutes, you got a show, you're working a thing against this guy, 2 minutes, go. And he would, have me do a promo. And then me and him would sit in the TV truck, look at it again, and he would analyze, what I'm doing right and doing wrong. And that's how, I learned, how to do promos the right way. It's like you just don't go up in front of a TV camera and, spout out 2 minutes worth of junk. Right. Because, if you go on YouTube these days, you could see a bunch of junk that these guys are spitting out that don't mean a darn thing.
Right.
They couldn't draw flies with the stuff that they're saying. Yeah. And that's how it really started for me. And the Sheik gave me an opportunity one time. I did some shows, and I managed at very first, 1974, October 9th, I'll never forget it, I managed Beautiful Ben Justice against Tony Marino. Mm-hmm. But what happened, the Sheik put me under a mask because I was still the photographer at that time. And so it's like, how, does this kid go to being a manager, when he's really the photographer here? People. So anyway, I did the shows like that. And then, after that, it's like, nothing happened. It's, the whole Bruiser, thing when the Bruiser rival promotion stopped. And he came on board with the Sheik, and they had a whole big program and stuff. And it's like, that really took over. And I was, my sort of thing got pushed to the side. And it's like, and I finally got an opportunity when Killer Brooks, Tony Marino, Terry Sullivan, Ben Justice, and a bunch of guys, went rival against them. And they wanted me to come and be their, top manager. And that's what really started it for me.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier you had that kind of that rock and roll image, that rock and roll approach, and everything else. And was that just natural for you? Was that just an extension of who you were at that time?
Yeah. I was a young kid into rock and roll, fancy clothes, and you got to look at it also, which I first started as a fan. Mm-hmm. So watching and seeing so many wrestlers. But seeing, so many managers, like Farouk and Ken Ramey and Bobby Davis, Bobby Heenan, George Cannon, Gary Hart, J.C. Dykes, Mark Manson, in your territory there. Yep. It's like, you have to distinguish yourself. You have to create a gimmick, a persona. Yeah. And that was, what I did. Yeah. And the things... when I was at ringside, it takes time. You learn, when to draw your heat, when to, you don't want to make the spotlight on yourself all the time, because you're managing a guy, and he's, the talent in the ring that, people should be watching. Right. But you have to know when to pick your spots, and you don't always, pull tights or, grab a leg, stuff like that. But you want to make the image of that's what you're going to do, because that's what the people think you're going to do. Right. So you crawl up slow and you go to reach for it, and they, you know what the crowd's going to do. They're going to, start yelling at the referee, and they're going to start yelling, and you can hear the, crowd, the voices getting higher and higher and higher. Mm-hmm. So you got them, and then you don't do it. So it's like, they think because of them, they stopped you from grabbing a tight or, handing your guy something or, something like that. Right. So it's like a whole big psychology, and it's like, you learn, how to play with their minds. Mm-hmm. And the best thing for me is that I was one of them at one time. So it's like I knew what they wanted. Mm-hmm. And, there would be a lot of times, overtime, that, at the end, I would be taking bumps and stuff. Just, I'd let guys throw me around, and, because it'd make the crowd pop. Mm-hmm. That's what they came to see. Sure. So that's what I'm going to give them. Right. And which, over time, it wasn't the greatest thing because I hurt every day. Being a 140-pound kid and these guys throwing me around, and I'm taking bumps, feels, everything. And it's like, oh, man, this hurts. Yeah. And you do that day after day after day, and people don't realize, even, workers, think, this is all fake. You guys know what you're doing. Okay, let you come and work with this guy for a week, and you go off the top rope, or take an elbow and take this, and see how you feel after a week, and see if you're going to say this is fake.
Right. Yeah, and you were one of the handful of guys that actually managed the Sheik. So how did you come to manage the Sheik, and what was that like? That's a very exclusive club of guys that served in that role.
Well, just in history, his wife, Joyce, was his valet, back in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And then he brought in Abdullah Farouk as his manager in the 60s and early 70s, and then Eddie Creechman, throughout the 70s. And, once Big Time Wrestling folded, I was working in the area doing, at the time, well, let me go back just for one quick second. Sure. Just because when I first became a manager, people think, oh, man, you make all this money. Well, I found out real quick, managers are they're a sub-attraction. You're an extra added attraction at a wrestling event. You're not a wrestler, and you don't make the money the wrestler does.
Right.
You make the special added attraction money, which is a lot less. And it's over time, my first year, it's God, I'm not really making any money here. Mm-hmm. I'd be getting $25 payoffs, $50, $75 here and there, But it's once, you figure in your gas, your hotels, your food and everything else, man, I'm not making any money. Well, nobody really told me this, that, the managers, you don't get wrestler pay. And that's why, I found out that, that's why guys like Bobby Heenan, Gary Hart, J.J. Dillon, Homer Odell, George Cannon, all those managers also wrestled. That's where they made their money. Mm-hmm. So there was only a few select guys like Abdullah Farouk, or the Grand Wizard, who he turned out to be, who made bigger money being a manager. But very few anybody else did.
Yeah.
So, that's why I had to take another job. And I got lucky, and I worked for AT&T, and I had a good job, and I would do the wrestling thing, if it was close during the week or on the weekends. And we had a show in Hamtramck, Michigan. I was managing Malcolm Monroe at the time. Mm-hmm. And we had a show, and the Sheik was on the show. So it's I hadn't seen him in, a number of years. So we're in the dressing room and shake hands, and we start talking, and and he says, hey, I've heard you've done some good stuff, and, okay, thanks, and, and I've known what he's done, Big Time Wrestling folded, you didn't want to say anything about that, but he's been, around the country, and he, doing a lot of stuff in Japan, and, he just blurted out, he's, putting his boots on and stuff like that, and he says, hey, how would you like to come out with me today? And it's you could have dropped me with a feather. It's I'm no, this can't be true. Pinch me, wake me up. And sure enough, he asked me to be then and there to be his manager. And from then on, for the next 2.5 years, on many local shows or shows that were within driving distance, I went out and managed them, and it was the greatest thrill of my life.
Yeah. So I've heard lots of guys tell stories about the Sheik away from the ring, behind the scenes, and you've told some of these stories here, that he seems like he was a very loyal, very dedicated to those who were dedicated to him, and very helpful. I mean, you talked about him helping you and working with you promos. Was that what he was like away from the ring? Was he this really dedicated, loyal guy? I mean, as long as you were on his good side, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, if the Sheik liked you, you were in that exclusive little club of his, yeah. And that was a very tight club to get into. And I'll say, I've seen the good side of the Sheik, and I've seen the very bad side of the Sheik. And I knew you didn't want to be on that bad side, because I've seen some very nasty, low down things over the years. That I can't believe guys went through, or the punishment that they took at his hands. But I also look at Harley Race. Going back into the very early 60s, when Harley Race, he was the driver for Happy Humphrey. Mm-hmm. He drove him from show to show. And then when Harley first started, working as a wrestler, his wife would go with him on, shows. And Harley one time, got in a very bad accident which killed his wife. And, he was laid up also and not being able to wrestle or to earn money. Mm-hmm. And the Sheik, who had never met Harley Race, sent him a check every month. And, you go, another one that I was told, from Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan, when he was, in Indianapolis where he lived, mm-hmm. He was selling popcorn and everything and taking the ring jackets back.
Sure.
What, before he was even a manager or anything, right. Sheik would, have him wash his car, mm-hmm. or, like in the wintertime, go warm his car up for him, before he left. And the Sheik would always, give him like $5 or $10. And back in the 60s, that was a nice little, chunk
sure.
of change for,
right.
a younger kid.
Yeah.
So, guys like that, Harley Race, Bobby Heenan, myself, and a number of others, if you were in his club, you were golden.
Yeah. And recently there's been a lot of resurgence in wrestling nostalgia. And you've done some events and you've published some books and written for some wrestling sites. Do you personally feel kind of a renewed interest in wrestling with all this new interest in nostalgia and the wrestling history? I mean, does that help inspire you to tell these stories, to come on shows like mine and do these things?
For me, it's, giving back.
Okay.
I was a fan. I had my fun there. I did the photography, and the writing thing in all the magazines, fine. I did my managing stuff, fine. Now it's like my time to give back. Okay. Wrestling has been so good to me. I want to give back to, the business, and I want to give back to the fans. Okay. One thing, I've had some comments on Facebook recently about there was a wrestler, it'll remain nameless right now, but everybody will probably know who it is. He's charging like $15,000 per hour.
Yeah.
To come to a wrestling event. And then he wants $150 for, a photograph to sign or to have your picture taken. I mean, this is goddamn ridiculous.
Yep.
Come on. These newer guys have made so much money, millions, over like the last 10, 15, 20 years of their career. Mm-hmm. And now they want to bleed fans of whatever money they have left who have supported them. Now that really strikes a chord with me.
Right.
So, a lot of, you say the nostalgia stuff, the books that I, have done, and then Scott Teal, who has done,
sure,
unbelievable books.
Right, yeah.
But you can ask him, they don't sell much.
Right.
The people, from the old days, the 50s, 60s, 70s era, they're either not alive anymore, or if they are, they're not spending any money to read anything on, anybody from back in that era.
Right, yeah.
So we're really a dead era. And I mean, there's been times that, people ask me to do a book on the Sheik and stuff. It's like, it would be a labor of love. Mm-hmm. It would take me, a number of years and a lot of work, but it wouldn't be financially feasible.
Right.
I wouldn't make any money.
Yeah.
Sure. Because you ask the normal fan these days, say, and I get it around town here, hey, this guy used to manage the Sheik. Oh, really? You managed the Iron Sheik? And it's like, it takes me everything to not punch the guy right in the frickin' face.
Yeah, right.
Don't you know who the original Sheik is? Oh, yeah. He's the one that calls you a jabroni. Oh, my God. So it's like, it's no different than any other sport, football, baseball, basketball, and stuff. Yeah. You ask, basketball fans about Dr. J or John Havlicek, they have no idea
sure.
who it is.
Yep.
And then I can name guys like that in any other sport. And, these days it's like all the money. The you say the resurgence, there ain't no resurgence in, the older guys. It's
right.
all the guys who, were, WW, that WWE crap, stuff.
Yeah.
Who are still going to pay $50, $100, and it's like, these guys are the greatest things on the face of the earth. But, hey, you're forgetting the history of the sport and the guys who paved the way for them to be where they're at now.
Yeah. Yeah, I always say, because, like the Sheik was clearly one of the greatest traveling touring draws of all time. I think he was only maybe him and Andre, maybe, the NWA champion that actually got like a cut of the gate. That's how much of an attraction they were.
Yep.
But I've always said, history's who controls it. And, the big company in New York controls a lot of the history. So a lot of people don't, they don't see this. They don't remember that because that's not what they're pushing on TV because they don't have anything to gain by it. So.
Well, that's why, you have your podcast.
Sure. Yeah.
You're trying to keep that old spirit alive and stuff.
Yep.
There's, kayfabe memories online. There's a number of Facebook sites that, keep it alive and stuff that I contribute to and do photographs and, and like I mentioned before, my tribute videos.
Yeah.
I have, a big library of photographs that, from over the years. Plus, Brian Buchanan has the whole Wrestling Review, Wrestling Monthly, and Ring Wrestling archive.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's times that have time. I say, Brian, hey, pull a file on this guy. Pull a file on this guy, and then we get together. He brings them over, and I do tribute videos on these guys.
Sure.
And it's like it's just my time. I don't ask any money for it or anything, and it's for people to relive and enjoy. And see photographs of these guys that, the photographs, most of them are never seen before, and, on YouTube, certain ones like my, Haystack Calhoun has like 40-some thousand views.
Mm-hmm.
My Sheik one, just like astronomical thousands of views, so, that's how I try to keep, these guys' memory alive. And, sorry to say that most of them, haven't lived long enough to see these tributes, but,
right.
Fans remember them, like myself and you and so many others. That's the only way, to keep their memory alive.
Sure. And as we wrap up here, tell us about that. We've talked, you mentioned your videos. They're great. So how would someone that wants to see these videos, what's the easiest way for them to find it or to go onto YouTube? What's the easiest thing to look up to find your channel on there to see these videos?
Just type in my name, Dave Brzezinski, and it's Burzynski.
Sure. Okay. And if they want to keep in touch with you, what else can they do? What other forms of social media do you welcome fans on your Facebook and to contact you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they're dedicated fans, look me up on Facebook. No problem. I love, putting up stuff on, my wrestling stuff. And, I have a whole nother Facebook page that deals with my wine career.
Yeah.
I'm a big wine guy and, ran one of the largest wine shops in the city of Detroit here. And now I have one of the big wine website that we've came out with.
Right. Go ahead and plug that because, you just really recently unveiled that site. Go ahead and give that address and for people that might be interested in checking that site out for your wine site.
Oh, it's www.winetime.
Okay.
WINETIME.com.
Sure.
Easy.
Yeah, go ahead and check it.
It's a informational, educational wine website that we try to help, at least in Michigan and the Detroit area here, independent retailers, restaurants, and distributors.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and if I will make sure here in my show notes, if anybody wants to check out, I'll put a direct link to your YouTube channel here in the show notes. So anybody that's listening to this that wants to check out Dave's YouTube page and those tribute videos, all you got to do is go into the show notes, and there'll be a clickable link right there for you to go and make sure you go and subscribe to that and get his updates when he puts those out there. So Dave, let's wrap this up. One thing that I always say, and I say a lot.
Wrap this up.
Yeah.
We've only been on for 45 minutes? I thought we had like 2 hours, 3 hours. Come on.
We may have to do a part 2, 3, so on. Who knows? We can always bring you back for more. But one thing I always tell people is that to me, Midwest professional wrestling has always been very underappreciated. Even though in the 60s and 70s, it was such a huge success and such a huge draw, particularly big time wrestling there. Tell the people that maybe aren't familiar with the Midwest wrestling and only hear about the Carolinas or Florida or what, the more notable, the ones that get all the press and tell us what was like, big time wrestling was like in an overview in their heyday, and what they're missing and have missed in this underappreciated territory.
Well, like big time wrestling, first of all, and WWA, and the Bruisers promotion, they had some of the greatest talent in the world. They had some of the biggest cards. Drew some of the biggest crowds. I mean, back in the early 70s, when the Sheik was running big time wrestling, he outdrew everybody.
Sure.
There was no promotion in the country that was even touching him. Not even New York, the Crockett's, nobody. I mean, he was selling out everywhere. He was selling out Detroit every week to every 2 weeks. Cincinnati, Dayton, Toledo, Canton, just everywhere. And then, the talent that they had. I mean, a lot of, and I get this a lot of times where people say, well, the big-time promotion, the Sheik's promotion here failed because he failed to, take himself off the top. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
You learn your history and find out. The Sheik, dropped the belt to a lot of guys. Sure. Bobo, Tony Marino, Firpo, Ox Baker, Dusty Rhodes, on numerous occasions.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't always on top.
Yep.
But you have to figure this, that, when those other guys had the belt, you'd have, just say, a main event of Bobo and Don Kent. What was the draw there? It didn't draw. Bobo versus Ox Baker, didn't draw. Firpo against Tony Marino, didn't draw. Marino versus Killer Brooks, doesn't draw. What drew? The Sheik.
The Sheik, yep.
That's what people came to see.
That's right.
Whether he was champion or whether he wasn't champion, they came to see the Sheik.
That's right.
Everybody else was, icing on the cake, be it the midgets, the girls. I mean, hey, I can't take away from a Killer Brooks Tony Marino bout because those were always bloodfest, unbelievable, beatdowns. The Kangaroos matches, Stomper and Justice, anytime the Hells Angels, just love them. The Love Brothers, Mercy Sakes, one of the greatest tag teams to come through Detroit. You had the Mighty Igor, you had Ben Justice, you had the Stomp. You can't list the names of talent that came through this area that drew these fans. And more than anything, when you mention the Sheik and the big-time wrestling and stuff like that, and especially Cobo Arena, I said for many years, and I tried to get the Sheik into the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame, and they laughed in my face. And I said they should put a bronze statue on top of Cobo Arena of this guy, because not only for the wrestling and stuff, but you have to figure him as the promoter, behind the scenes. Look how much money he generated for the city of Detroit and brought the number of people downtown every Saturday.
Yep.
The tax dollars that he created. People don't see that kind of stuff.
Right. Absolutely.
He was out drawing, the Detroit Pistons when they, ran there. Nobody drew more fans in the history into the Cobo Arena than the Sheik and Big Time Wrestling.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Dave, thanks for coming on and sharing just a few of your stories. Like I said, we may have to have you on again sometime and do it again and go more in depth. Again, look in the show notes. There will be a link there. Go to that and subscribe to Dave's YouTube channel so you can get all his tribute videos he does. Dave, thanks for coming on. We appreciate
I really appreciate you having me on. I hope I entertained your fans.
Absolutely.
And hopefully people listen to the podcast.
You've heard him here on the Dave Dynasty Show as a guest and as host of the monthly Graham's Gallery episodes. And now you can hear his stories. You can own a copy of Confessions of a Big-Time Wrestler, the audio book from Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., former multi-tag team champion in WWA and owner of Bruiser Bedlam. You can hear all of his encounters with the various wrestlers, places, and promotions he's worked. as he tells about his colorful, long, and illustrious career. You can have your own copy for only $25, and that includes shipping and handling. It's very simple. Go on Facebook, look up Jerry Jaffe, Jaffe, send him a private message, and make arrangements to purchase a copy of Confessions of a Big-Time Wrestler now. You will not regret this purchase. All right, we're back on the Dave Dynasty Show. I am your host, Dave Dynasty. Let's wrap this thing up. Special thanks to Dave Drazen for coming on the show. Special thanks to Prof Ouch and Abdullah the Butcher for that audio sent in from that recent appearance. Very, very cool stuff. Let me tell you where you can find us now. If you go online, you can go to davedynasty.com. That is kind of the central hub. Right there, you can find everything you need. We're on all social media. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. Of course, we have a great YouTube channel. We're trying to get our YouTube channel to 1,000 subscribers. We are getting close. We're inside 200. So we're really starting to pick up some subscribers here lately. If we get to 1,000, we can monetize the channel again and have a little funds coming in from that. So if you do not follow us, or subscribe to us, on YouTube, go look up Dave Dynasty, subscribe to us, or you can go to davedynasty.com. There's a link at the top. If you'd like to financially support the show, and we do appreciate that, it helps us tremendously, keep this thing for free every week for you. You can make a one-time contribution by going to paypal.me/thedavedynasty, or you can make ongoing monthly contributions at patreon.com/thedavedynasty. Please, anything helps. It helps keep us free, helps pay for our services, our hostings, equipment, the trips we take to do things, helps with all that. So anything you can help is great. If you're into what we do and you dig what we do, we appreciate that. Or if you'd like to get a little something, go to PROWRESTLINGTEES.com/theDaveDynasty and buy one of our shirts. And you can get a shirt there, and a little bit comes to us and helps us out. If you go to davedynasty.com, there's also links there for Amazon.com and HighSpots.com. Those are our affiliate links. It costs you nothing additional to do your shopping, and we get a little kickback, and that helps too. So any of those ways helps support the show, and we do appreciate it. Thanks for listening again this week. Thanks for everything you guys do, all the sharing that you do. I mean, our social media is great. We share a lot of stuff, a lot of classic pictures, newspaper clippings, lots of great stuff, historically speaking, and modern stuff that is relevant to the Midwest. I share a lot of cool things. So make sure you're following us on those sites and helping spread the words. Every retweet you give us, every like you give us, every share you give us, it helps network and spread the Midwest Express out to the world and get some eyes on Midwest Pro Wrestling and its importance and how important and talented the people are here. So, again, thank you very much. I am Dave Dynasty, and this is the Dave Dynasty Show. We will see you next week. But until then, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.